Welcome to Tāwara or Tawai, Water New Zealand's podcast series. In this discussion, we're focusing on the pathway to transforming water services in Aotearoa. Day one for the proposed new water service entities is the 1st of July 2024, and until then, we're in a period of transition. 2 decades ago, Scotland embarked on a very similar journey when it underwent a huge transformation of water services delivery. Sutherland is the Chief Executive of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, WICS, the economic regulator for water and sewage in Scotland. Recently, during a recorded webinar for Water New Zealand members, I asked him for his reflections on Scotland's transformation and started by questioning him about the transition phase.
I think it's interesting because you used two words there, and I'm not going to say you used them interchangeably, you used them sort of slightly sequentially, but I think it's really important to distinguish between the two words. So the first word is transition, right? Getting from where you are now to where you want to be, right? In terms of organizational establishment, in terms of governance frameworks, and, clarity of purpose and all of that sort of thing. And then there is the real hard work of transforming service delivery and making it much, much better for citizens, customers, stakeholders generally. I think it's really important to keep those two things separate because the transition phase has to be relatively short. It has to be pretty clear in its objectives. On the 1st of July 2024, water has to come out of taps. Wastewater has to go away. Any crisis that happens has to be handleable. People have to be able to be billed for a service. People have to have somewhere to call if there's an issue. People need to know how much money they're going to have to spend, and they have to know what expectations there are as to what they're going to achieve in spending that money. Right? That's going to be done within some form of different governance framework. That's the transition, right? The transformation then is about how do you move from that day one situation to where, frankly, we're still working at it and working at it hard, where we would like to be. And that means investing in the right areas, investing in as targeted a way as possible, understanding condition, performance, risk levels of assets, understanding what the priorities of citizens and customers and politicians and local communities are, for water courses, their water quality, and all the rest of it. That's just an unending journey, seems to me. I think one of the mistakes that we made in Scotland, we made lots, but one of the ones we really made was we tried to be, we tried to sort of think, right, we've got a transformation phase. And if, we do this in the next 5 years, then we'll have transformed. I don't think it's been like that at all. It's been just another layer of the onion gets peeled, another layer. And at the moment we haven't got to any core yet.
I think sometimes people talk about the need for a North Star, something to aim for. Now, I always, in the New Zealand context, think it's the wrong thing to be talking about. I feel like we should aim for the Southern Cross, but maybe that's me. But do you know what I mean? That directional, because if it's about, as you just said, unpeeling a layer of the onion, it's like, what have I got? What can I do to improve it? Is that like the continuous improvement bit as opposed to the bigger step change?
Well, I think it is genuinely, I think, really important to have a very clear aspiration about what you're trying to achieve. And it's probably important to have a date by when you would like to get there. But I think it's one of these things where If what you're talking about is within a public sector environment, and we're very much in a public sector environment in Scotland, you're wanting an organisation that's going to be as effective as any commercial organisation, then that vision that you're talking about, really important, right? But the thing that probably differentiates a private corporation from government, certainly at home, would be that a private corporation, if it sets a vision, right, management are on the hook for achieving the vision, right? And if they don't achieve it, there are consequences, right? In government, again, at home, right, we set visions, and if we get close to them, we pat ourselves on the back and say how well we've done, right? That's not enough, right? Because if you want that discipline, if you want that level of effectiveness, right? Again, emphasizing within a public environment, you've got to have that commercial rigor that goes with a very well managed corporate.
And that's when having Wix as an economic regulator looking at what Scottish Water is doing has been able to provide, quasi.
Look, as an economic regulator, if I want to keep bills down, if I set out and I say, look, do you know what? You can be more efficient. Do you know what? You don't need to invest in that just now. You can wait. Do you know what? Actually, we can cut this corner here just now. I could do that, right? And maybe politicians would quite like it. Maybe customers would quite like it, right? But they wouldn't like the consequences of it, right? Because in 3 or 5 or 10 years' time, I'm going to be in a position where I've got to reverse that. I'm going to have to say, well, do you know what? We didn't spend the money on it then, so we have to spend it now. And we've got this other thing that's come due as well, and it's actually become quite urgent as well, right? So you have what you would end up with is prices coming down, then prices going sharply up, or levels of service falling, or a major failure, or something of that ilk, right? So the job of the economic regulator is really to plot a course, a financial course, an economic course between now and that vision achievement. It's not about the next 5 years or the next 10 years, because if you get truncated in that sort of time frame in an industry like this, which has got the sort of asset lives that it's got, you'll be doing the wrong thing, right? Because you'll be looking at it. Does it make sense in a 10-year view? Yeah, it seems to. Does it make sense in a 30-year view? Oh, maybe it doesn't actually.
So in terms of getting that vision and getting that sort of the longer term perspectives, one of the pieces that I feel is so important is having a broader community engagement on that, because there's different components. We're all aware of different pieces. Whether it's in the New Zealand context, the Te Mata ROI, or local mana whenua, or local councils, or other stakeholders that are involved in that conversation. And has that been, in terms of in Scotland, how have those sorts of equivalent conversations, how have they occurred, and have you got a common view of the future, of the vision?
So I think first thing to say is about 2 or 3 years ago, we actually put in place an industry vision. And basically that was an exercise in which all the different stakeholders participated quite actively. So there was extensive representation from customers, there was environmental regulators, there were water quality regulators, there was economic regulators, there was government, there was the delivery entity itself, because it wasn't the supply chain. So there was a wide sort of view in putting together a vision. With hindsight, is that vision as tightly defined as it could have been? Probably not. It still needs a bit of work, but there is one there. Before that, The government has, as you probably expect, with a single entity and with sort of national pride being quite important in Scotland, government's played a really important role in terms of holding the courts while people debated what should be being done and in what timescales. So they've run a process that we call quality and standards. And that process essentially defined what should we be investing in, why should we be investing in it, how much do we think we can afford to do, how much can we actually do, because you've got one constraint, which is the ability of the organisation itself to plan, manage and deliver, or manage the delivery of a capital programme. Then you've got the constraint potentially around what the supply chain might be able to do. And that might sound a bit strange, supply chain constraints, but if you need lots of work done in a particularly rural area, for example, supply chain might not find that as easy as it would find it to do in a couple of the bigger, more urban areas.
So just thinking about some of that vision and not having, I'll go and look up the vision that was developed a few years back, but if I'm imagining the types of things that I anticipate would be in it, there might be something that's about decarbonising, there might be something about getting more digital information, there might be something about lifting capability and capacity of the workforce, those sorts of concepts.
What are the advantages that we've had? Well, one advantage that we've had is that we have been able to encourage and foster the development of skills. So there's been opportunities for people doing everything from data science, looking at statistics on pump effectiveness and and asset lives and all that sort of analysis, to people that are doing hydraulic modelling of where water goes in the event of a bit too much of it being dropped on us, to people looking at how is climate affecting water courses and all of that. Now, that is work that probably some of it's a bit new, some of it's a function of recent developments in science or in computing technology and that sort of thing. But sometimes a lot of that expertise was sort of things that were required occasionally, not sort of on an ongoing basis. And one of the benefits that we've had is that's now all internalised and it becomes part of business as usual and planning as usual within the bigger entity.
And I suspect one of the pieces there is that if you've got somebody within the entity that's sort of, or a series of people who've got those sorts of responsibilities, they're more alert to the, why haven't you talked to me about this bit?
Yes, of course.
Whereas if that person is outside the organisation, you've got to remember to contact them to see if it's relevant that they should be part of the conversation and those sorts of pieces.
Yeah, frictional costs and the ability to keep people properly informed and in the loop and feeling like they can contribute and feeling like they know enough to be able to contribute is terribly important. I think the whole lessons of lockdown and working from home and all that sort of thing in the last few years has been a really interesting wake up. As to just how much benefit we were getting from having these people together all of the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the opportunity to have these sorts of conversations, I know that we're talking to you on Zoom, but but it's one of those, it is, having people in the office, having those actual personal interactions, it can be they are so important. Just going back to sort of thinking about the workforce and some of the changes that we might see with bringing the entities together, and some of those things that you've seen in Scotland. you able to sort of reflect on that a bit?
So I think the first thing to say is across the water industry in Scotland, there are far more people employed today than there were 30 years ago, right? Now they're employed often in different places. So the supply chain, much as I was talking just now about some of these specific technical things being brought in-house, the supply chain is the area which is seeing huge growth in terms of numbers of employees and numbers of people involved. Scottish Water itself is today is probably about a third fewer employees than it had at the time of there being three authorities. But overall, that's there's that higher number. Just to be clear, there has never been a single compulsory redundancy in Scottish Water. There were different programmes at the start where people took early retirement and that sort of thing, but as likely as not, they reappeared somewhere in the supply chain very, very quickly. We're not as blessed as we'd like to be with the skills that we require to deliver the amounts of investment we need delivering.
And sort of thinking about, I think you and I talked at some point around, sort of operators and depots and different ways of working, and about how things might have changed in Scotland, and thinking about what might happen here.
I don't know how depots and jobs are dispatched now, but I used to have a moderate amount of fun on my journeys from St Andrews, where I live, to Stirling, where our office was, which is like 55 miles of cross-country roads, and you would pass the water vans. I would count the number of vans, and I would tease them mercilessly about how on earth could they need this number of people on this relatively short stretch of road. And usually do a calculation which said how many people it must be employed you weren't telling me about, or some such mischievous technique. But on a serious note, if I take the very rural area in the far north of Scotland where my parents live, mother lives now, they would have, or they used to have, a depot in the town of Wick, small town, and that depot would serve communities in probably 40 or so mile radius. So it's in right the corner of the country, so it's a segment of the circle or whatever. And the way it would work is that by the time they picked up all the people that had to be picked up from the depot, they would only have a chance to do about 4 hours work to have the van back by the end of the designated shift, because the rules were under the authorities that overtime didn't get paid, so people weren't going to work overtime, were they? So now what would happen is there would be probably just one person in that van rather than 2 or 3. Jobs will come to their home by on a tablet or a handheld device, and they'll go straight from home to the job. They won't go to the depot. So the whole job, the whole way of doing things has changed very fundamentally, and will continue, I think, to change in that way.
Yeah. Just sort of thinking about how one of the stories that was on the news at the beginning of the year in New Zealand was around poor water notices.
Yeah, I saw that.
Some of which have been in existence for...
I saw some wonderful headline of us saying 20 odd years or something.
Something like that.
Yes.
And I guess for those neighbourhoods, transformation for them ought to be getting off a poor water notice. What is it in terms of what's been the experience in Scotland in terms of that, the consumer experience?
Right. Look, if you have got properly rigorous policing of water quality, you are never going to get rid of an occasional boil water notice, right? You're never going to get rid of all of the time, right? But you certainly shouldn't have them for extended periods of time. And you should be able to make sure that they are very swiftly dealt with if and when they do arise. Now, what is critical to that is two things. One is that the level of investment is actually being properly committed. And the second is that there's sufficient analysis going on as to what might impact water sources or might impact the network in future, such that you can be taking steps proactively in your maintenance policies or whatever to avoid the incident happening, rather than being in a place where you end up being in responsive reactive mode. Proactive is always going to be cheaper than reactive.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I can see there's a question that's popped up. I might have misheard Alan, but it sounded like Scottish Water has a third of the staff it started with, some by early retirement, but the sector as a whole has more staff. I might have understood that the workforce has migrated to the contracted and the subcontracted sector.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Yeah, it's not got a third of the staff it started with, it's about a third less. So it would have started with about 6,500 employees, and it's probably today at about 4,200.
Yeah.
At one point it will have gone down to 33, 3,400, but that was because they were trying to meet short-term targets and doing things. As I said, they were taking that really short-term view rather than what the right thing to do over time was.
And at the same
It's
time,
probably something I did wrong as well in not being clear about what the intentions
were. And I think that's around, isn't it, in terms of the really good engagement between regulator and regulatee and the wider sector in terms of understanding.
That interaction, Gillian, is so critical. Number one message I've been giving to Comcom and to Tāwara is they have to be joined at the hip in terms of their understanding of what each other are trying to do and why they're trying to do it. Because if they are in a position where politicians or media or other mischievous parties start putting pressure on one or the other, this is not value for money, why are you funding it? Or we can't do this because the regulator's not funded us to do it. Right? If those sorts of comments start getting made, you're on defensive, reactive, potentially toxic territory really quickly. And that will only detract from the job that needs doing.
Yep.
So regulation is not about having big stakes. It's about having robust debates. But it's not about sort of, punch and judy shows or anything of that type. It's something, it's much more about, the medium and longer term.
Yeah. And I think, getting that sort of that consensus in terms of why something's needed.
We got to have that completely.
Yeah. We're in the middle of making submissions on the two pieces of legislation that are at select committee. And certainly my reading of one of the bills, is talking about the Commerce Commission as their role as Water Services Commissioner, needing to get information from Te Mata Arawai as particularly with its drinking water, what's required to meet the drinking water standards, and sort of almost carving out, whether this is precisely what the drafting is really getting at, but sort of saying, if you tell us the dollars is this much, that it will be, we will put that in, or that sort of provision.
Yeah, I don't think any one party's got the monopoly on that particular bit of wisdom. I think that has to be a proper conversation between the people charged with delivery, including the supply chain, plus Te Mata Arawai, plus the economic regulator. I don't think, I wouldn't even begin to pretend I could put a value on that uniquely. We can, what we can do is we can look at different projects, we can look at benchmarks for how much they cost in other areas, other jurisdictions, that sort of thing, and we come to a view, right? But if something's new, can't do that. That has to be there might be input that we can get from the benchmarking, but it's not something we can answer on our own.
Yeah, and I guess in the New Zealand context, because parties need to be able to give effect to mana or to why, and that's got such a place-based it's founded in the place, that in terms of what's required to mitigate some of the perhaps previous pollution, or to ensure that it doesn't worsen over time, will be different. And so needing to be able to have those sorts of conversations will be important.
I'll give you an example, right? If you're to look at the press in the UK, you will see quite often at the moment a lot of commentary about unauthorised discharges from sewer overflows, and the first thing to say about that is it is quite amazing to me to watch how the different parties are responding to the pressure, because everyone's pointing the finger at someone else, right? I didn't know it was there, or you should have been monitoring that, or some such, right? That's been an issue since I started in Scotland, right? We've known that was there, and we've made a series of choices in Scotland about how fast we need to address it. And we're in a fortunate position that our watercourses are in much, much better shape than they are in the southeast of England. But that doesn't mean we're perfect or anything like it. We've got a huge amount still to do. But this problem's arisen and it's getting worse. And the reason it's arisen is, one, you had a particular design capacity that the sewers were built to deal with, right? That's changed, or that the pressure on them has changed for two reasons. One is we've paved over much more territory than we had before, so much more water finds its way into the sewer system. And the second reason is that they have been poorly maintained. So, there's a wonderful Black and Beach report, I think it was, about the need for the Thames Tideway in London. What would have happened had the Bazalgette sewer system being as well maintained as it could have been, right? And so not as big a tideway, right? Or maybe even no tideway, I think the report somewhat polemically suggested. And then the third thing that's happened, of course, is that we've got a very, very different set of rainfall patterns from what we used to have, right? So all of those three things are combined. So, at one level, it's no individual's fault, right? But if you get into a situation as I'm afraid they have done in England, of everyone pointing fingers at each other, then you're in a really bad place. Whereas, we're in the moment quite a fortunate place in Scotland, in the sense that we, government, the environment regulator, Scottish Water, are having a pretty open discussion about how quickly can we address this, what are the priorities, where should we start, given that we do have a much better level of river water quality than others do.
And I think it's that, in terms of being able to improve, part of it is taking the wider community on that journey. It's not just the people that are the regulators or the business, but it's about you and me as a consumer, about understanding how quickly can change occur. So our expectations are managed.
Because again, in Scotland, because government's been running this Q&S process, the speed at which these sewer overflows are being dealt with was being discussed. We weren't shirking away from there being an issue. It was just that for quite a lot of time, it wasn't necessarily the number one priority on the list. Yep. So it wasn't getting solved maybe quite as quickly as some might like, or some would like today. But there was no hiding from the fact that there is an issue, right? What seems to have happened south of the border is that people just didn't even know what was happening. which is a very different
Yes.
situation now. You know, where was everyone involved? And I'm sure not everyone in Scotland knew that it was an issue. Far from that, right? But at least I think there was much less surprise in political media community that there was issues, and you know, and therefore it's been a more manageable thing to deal with.
I mean, I know one of the pieces that you know, in New Zealand, the Water New Zealand has over the years taken you know, through the National Performance Review, collected data around wet weather overflows. But those wet weather overflows are the ones that have been either seen by they've been seen by somebody and they've been reported by somebody, you know, to the councils. But it's only the ones that have been reported as opposed to the ones that have been happening that we're all oblivious to, you know, either because it's not quite got above ground or someone didn't realise they could report. And those sorts of pieces, I think, is such a...
Or even that there was something wrong.
Well, exactly, actually, you know, it's always been like that. Whereas the one that I've often sort of, you know, say to people when they say, you know, I've got a lovely freshwater spring in the garden. You say, have you checked whether it's a freshwater spring? Now, there's a few more questions related to the sort of the size of the sector. So if the sector staff has grown in Scotland and the contracting sector is much larger, how do you justify your claims of 60% OPEX savings and 50% CAPEX savings from a reform? If the answer is regulation, the regulators are going to regulate the sector even if we keep it under council control, council ownership.
Oh, nothing like a provocative question, eh? Well, the answer to that is whether you like it or not. And obviously, from the way the questions worded, you don't like it, and I'm probably not going to convince you otherwise. Have a look at what Scottish Water's costs were back in 2001-2, and have a look at where they are now. Adjust for the new operating costs associated with bringing on new assets. And what you'll see is that 60% number. So you might not like it, but the truth of the matter is it's there. And it's not just there in Scotland, it's there with all the major companies in England as well. So is it about regulators? Yes, in part, but it's also about good governance. It's about good management. It's about focused decision-taking, consistent decision-taking, and making the right decisions at the right time because the money's there when you need it. So, yeah, okay, I get that you don't like it, but sorry, tough luck. It's there.
Continuing on the sort of the question around sort of, you know, workforce, there's a follow-up question around understanding where staff growth is. Is it in blue collar operators, data and digital compliance testing?
I don't have that data, but you know, what I can tell you is that there's I think it's about 11,500 or 12,000 people work in directly Three Waters related roles, whether that's in Scottish Water or the supply chain or wherever. You know, there. I would be very surprised if you didn't see that there weren't increases in all those areas, blue collar data, digital compliance, well, maybe not digital. Yeah, I do see some very large numbers being talked about as to quantities of people involved in digital in New Zealand, and yeah, we certainly don't have anything like that number. But you know, very active compliance, very active testing jobs. You know, we're delivering an investment program of $4.5 billion a year. So at the moment, and that's going to go up by 40 or 50, double probably actually over the next 20 years. So there's going to be no shortage of people digging up things or building things.
And I certainly think if you look at, you know, the figures that you know, the work that yourself has done, Alan, in terms of, you know, estimating the need for investment, you know, using the council figures in terms of the getting to 125 billion, I think, in terms of, and then if
No, it's just worth exploring this number a little bit, right? Because again, it's one of these things that people don't like, right? Or they say, oh, it can't possibly be that amount, right? So if I just take the asset lives that councils have told me their assets have, right? Which, to be honest with you, are much longer than our asset lives at home, right? And given you have the odd shake in the ground here and whatever, then it seems a bit unlikely that you would have consistently longer asset lives than us. But let's just use your number just now. Let's just take the asset values that are reported by councils just now, even though there seems to be a complete mismatch between the value you ascribe to those assets and what you pay for similar new things just now. So let's accept that as a given, right? If I take those two things and I combine them, right, between now and 2050, you need about $90 billion to cover the average annual cost of replacing those assets, right? Just on a steady portfolio, right? Now, some years it'll be far more than that, than the 3 billion a year. Some years it'll be a lot less than that. On the average, you would expect it to be 3 billion. That is just basic arithmetic, okay? So the second thing that you have to add in then is what is the growth that is expected across New Zealand, right? And if you take what councils say is the low end, their growth estimate, that is equivalent to across New Zealand a 1.5% compounded increase in the number of connections each year between now and 2050, right? So if you, again, you go back to the council's information on asset values and you say, right, they are going to be no more expensive or no less expensive than the average asset value per citizen today, which would be a little bit strange, right? Because brownfield you expect to be cheaper, but greenfield you expect to be a lot more than that, right? Let's just take the average, then that adds about another 25 billion or something onto how much investment we need to deal with growth, right? So the remaining 60 odd billion, right, is the money in improving water quality, improving discharges to the aquatic environment, dealing with water resource issues, dealing with the boil water notices, all that stuff that we were talking about earlier, right? So that's your 185 billion, right? There is nothing in there for seismic. There is nothing in there for climate change adaptation. Been a few pictures about that over the last few days, isn't there, right? So that 185 billion, in my view, is about as little as it is going to be, right? I don't believe the 120 billion number, right? So, you know, BK looked at it and said, we were right. I think we were right, but then I'm an economic regulator, so right? So if now, obviously, there's the opportunity to do something on the efficiency side, right? The efficiency is on the enhancement bit, right? It is not on the maintenance, replacement, growth bit, because that is a function of already numbers that are challenging, shall we say.
And certainly if you're taking those investments, you know, we aren't going to be able to do all of those investments without growing the sector.
No, you know.
Because we know that we don't have enough people today. We've got vacancies left, right and centre, both within councils, within consultants, within equipment, within suppliers, everywhere.
Yeah, our total's got up 40 or 50%.
Yeah, no, totally. Now, I think there might be another question that I have seen. How long and how difficult was the transformation into a commercially focused Scottish Water from where it was before regulation?
So actually, a lot of it was really quick. To be fair to Scottish Water, they benefited from the appointment of their first chief executive, who was a man called Dr. John Hargreaves. I had more than the odd argument with him, right? But he has sadly died subsequently. Wasn't particularly healthy, unfortunately. But John had a career in Northumbrian Water, had reached managing director of Northumbrian Water, and Suez, the French water entity, took over Northumbrian Water, and John got redeployed into selling concessions of Suez around the world. So John took the role in Scottish Water because he wanted to prove that he should have done a much bigger job from the French. And because he had that sort of determination about him, he was really effective. So go back to that challenge about cost reduction, right? I don't have to look at costs today to see that 40% reduction in OPEX. I can see it actually in 2006, 4 years later. So will it ever be as commercial and entrepreneurial as someone like me might want? Probably not, right? That's why I said it's an ongoing transformation. But the old 80-20 rule applies, and they probably got 80% of the way in the first 4 or 5 years.
Totally. There's another question here. Is it fair to say that the significant investment in terms of capital that has occurred in Scotland, new and upgraded water, waste plants, transmission, distribution, storage, etc., has enabled more efficient operations and better customer service, so less incidents, emergency response improvements, and given greater asset planning, thinking about stormwater solutions, 1 and 2 experience? Not quite sure what that bit is, but
so I'll explain. Scottish Water Solutions is a joint venture company that got created by Scottish Water.
All right. Okay.
And it was a joint venture company that involved the supply chain and what was Northwest Water United Utilities in terms of how that supply chain got managed. And John Hargreaves' rationale for doing that at the time was that I've got a huge challenge on getting my operating side of the business functioning in the way that I want it. And so given that I've also got this huge step function change to deliver in capital, I'm going to, in effect, create a venture that creates the right incentives for that to be happening in parallel to me focusing on the operating bit. But the question was absolutely spot on, right? Because there was that real prioritized big push on investment. There was, and particularly a move towards doing things much more proactively rather than waiting for them to happen. There was a huge improvement in terms of the levels of service experienced by customers. And that is on water quality, it was on bursts, it was on network performance across the board.
And I guess that's one of the things that these new entities will need to think about in terms of how do you structure? Do you have a team that's sort of, whether it's a separate business unit or whether it's slightly further outside, that is saying, right, I'm going to think about the innovations and the transformations and all those proactive things. Because if I'm inside the building, I am going to be so focused on dealing with the extra reactive piece that is always being thrown at a business.
Yeah, I think the other thing is there's a bit of a danger that people get into because you're accessing scale economies, that you start thinking there's a one-size-fits-all scenario. I don't really think that's right. That you've got to think about what is needed in particular locales. And the question is, how do you solve the question better? Not necessarily you do it in the same way in every particular part of your network. So, with entities as different as a potential entity A and an entity D, right? Just the geography is so different, population densities are so different. The way in which it ultimately gets organised and the way it ends up being effective is going to be quite different. Right? Scottish Water does not organise itself in the same way in Edinburgh and Glasgow as it does on the Highlands and Highlands. It's quite tricky to manage islands, right? Because they get cut off, it gets pretty rough and in weather. So they have to maintain a level of service and resilience in the islands that they could compensate for by moving staff around more quickly in, say, the central belt Scotland. it's just different. And I would be surprised if it wasn't quite similarly different. That isn't too strange a term in New Zealand.
And I mean, I certainly look at sort of, the experiences that have been happening across the country this year. I mean, there are parts of the South Island that are in serious rainfall deficient mode, whereas we clearly in large amounts of the north have a massive excess. Question: how has Scotland gone about encouraging and enabling investment in smart and digital technologies? Similarly, how do you encourage the use of non-infrastructure solutions, so the customer behaviour change, policy changes, and those sorts of things?
Good question. So one of the things that Scottish Water has done in the digital space, which is a really fascinating thing, and I've got to visit it probably half a dozen times because every time I go, it just blows my mind. So they have a control room where, in effect, they can control pretty much any part of their network from this one spot. Now, it brings all sorts of security challenges and all the rest of it. But the specification of the control room is quite amazing because it's built to be sort of bomb-proof. Has walls about 2 feet thick and all this sort of thing. It's remarkable. And there's also security clearance for people that work in it. But the use of telemetry generally has been hugely important in terms of allowing for more effective management of many very small waste treatment or water treatment works, which really don't need to be manned all the time, but they do need to be sort of visited. So that telemetry has been really, really critical. The other part that I think has been really critical is the collection of information about what is actually happening in the network, and that's related to the telemetry, it's related to the control centre, it's related to the information requirements that are expected to come in from field operatives. And that's allowed them to start to understand and plan some of their investment interventions much better. So one of the examples I found particularly compelling when they showed me it was, here is what's happening with power use at a pump. And you see a nice steady line. And then you see power use increasing. And then you see, after quite a short period, pump failing, right? And so basically the pump is telling you, I'm not feeling very well. Please replace me. Please give me some medicine quite quickly, because otherwise I'm going to do something that you really don't like. But they didn't collect that information. They didn't know that. They didn't know that there was this correlation between increased energy usage and pump failure. But because there's often resilience in the network in terms of pumps, you can take one out without impacting performance. You can replace it with one that's functioning properly. And not only then do you save electricity, helping you reduce your operating costs, that's 60%, remember, you don't like, right? But you bring that down. And you also have a much lower capital cost intervention because you've done it proactively rather than waiting for the thing to blow up on you.
I mean, I'm a real fan of that, some of that digital information they're gathering, because you don't know what you don't know when you don't have any data.
No.
Just in the same way as I know about my electricity consumption because I've got a smart meter and I get that information. I don't have anything about my water consumption other than me sort of being conscious of what's going on in the house. And so if the same applies to other bits of the network, it's about having that information such that you can respond. I think there is a massive opportunity out there.
So the other part of that question around sort of non-infrastructure solutions, so I think that's is again a really interesting one. So I think there's there's different aspects of this. So one aspect of it could be that you say, well, do you know what? Best way of encouraging people to use less water is to charge them and have a meter. I think the evidence on that from around the world is mixed. It is clearly the case that when you first install meters, people's behaviour changes. But there's very mixed evidence as to whether that's a permanent shift or whether it just reverts back over time. Because let's face it, a cubic metre of water keeps the person going for a week, and that cubic metre of water, well, certainly at home probably cost you about a couple of dollars or something. So it's not exactly going to, are you going to have 3 baths less in order to save a couple of bucks? I'm sure you are, because you're spending far more than that in heating the bath water anyway. So metering might or might not have a role, and it probably have a role in different circumstances. But you've then got to think about sort of social equity roles and other people are making adequate contributions to the cost of the network, which is essentially fixed, purely volumetric charging basis. Much more interesting, though, I think, are 2 things, right? And the first is the heavy hand of government, right? So how do they make regulations which encourage, when properties are developed, that they use more water efficient devices, that they are they make use of grey water in the home, that your drainage is made natural rather than going into the sewer system or drainage system, and things like that. So there is definitely a role for government and regulations, because much as we might like to try and convince people to do things, it's not always the case. But there's also a real important role for community discussion. There's some really fascinating references in an OECD review of behavioral science applications. And it was in California where essentially during the drought, they told people on a street how much their neighbours were using per head, right? And that caused people to reduce their usage far more than any other of the parts of the experiment. Tried all sorts of things, metering, very high charges, and all sorts of things in a control area. And the sort of peer pressure, neighbour shame factor of using lots of water in drought was actually by far the most powerful. So there are real opportunities, but it's a question of understanding what works in a particular community and then keeping at it.
I think that
can be really effective.
Yeah, that information and getting people to think about the value of water, both in terms of not just what you pay as an individual, but ultimately whether you might need to, if by changing your behaviour you can avoid the network needing to invest in a new reservoir or a new bore, all of those sorts of things, and having that real understanding, I think, is important.
There was a very good example. There was a great campaign that Thames Water did just before the Olympics, because there was a real material risk that London was going to run out of water just before the Olympics, which would have been
slightly embarrassing.
It could have been a bit of a problem, and everyone thought the ad campaign had been really clever and it got under people's skins, and there was it induced behavioural response. But when it was being reviewed afterwards internally, the question was asked, which is an absolute killer question. We'd known there was a risk of this happening 3 or 6 months before we actually did anything.
Yep.
And if we put in that ad campaign at that time, what would have happened? Now, we don't know because we didn't try it, but it might well have been something that could have taken out of all the worry beats that were expended at the time.
It's a fascinating area, that one. I'm conscious that we are approaching the end of our time, but there's another question that, if you don't mind, can you explain the ring fence fund for encouraging investing in projects that are not the most financially efficient?
Oh, someone has been doing their homework. I'm impressed. So this is a situation where if I took a project and let's say its carbon footprint in the best, cheapest financial option was really, really significant. And if I said how much, what's the value of that carbon, right? I'm not paying for it, right? I don't have to pay for that carbon at the moment. I might pay a bit of tax, or whatever, but I don't really pay the true cost of that carbon. Particularly as if I look out into the future and I see what carbon costs might do, right? Given that if I put a solution in now, it's going to have that carbon footprint on an operating basis and an ongoing basis. So the challenge to Scottish Water is show me solutions which, when you value that carbon, are actually cheaper than the financial ones. So add the carbon into the analysis. If that means that you actually have to spend more money, I'll compensate you for the delta in the extra spend, right? Because from a societal point of view, it's better that we do the best economic answer, which is valuing the externality carbon plus the underlying cost of the asset intervention, right? So that's what it's there for, because if I don't put that incentive there, they do the cheapest thing because they've only got a fixed budget to work with.
And so I guess, when I remember I'm an environmental economist, the carbon, fortunately today, has got a far more understood value to it. The ability to swim on the coast or in a lake or on a beach or whatever is we all value it, but it's got a intangible.
Yeah.
So are you able to have the same conversation?
Well, that it would be a similar thing, right? So you're talking there probably about social capital. You could also talk about natural capital. You could talk about amenity value, strong part of social capital. So, what's the impact, right? If if you're building something that could be built to blend in with the environment more, or be built underground or whatever, so that these things just need to be being thought about, and they need to be being valued in terms of what's being delivered, and encouraging that conversation between between Scottish Water and its customers and the communities it's serving is really, really important.
Thank you. I think maybe that's a great place to leave it in terms of, as we look forward, it is the encouraging the conversations throughout our communities such that we can reach a point when we can feel that we are improving and transforming the water sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And remember, it's always easier to see the improvements in hindsight rather than in advance.
That was Alan Sutherland, Chief Executive of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. I'm Gillian Blythe. Thank you for listening to Tāwara o Te Wai.